Okay, so we're starting Pirqe Abot, Perek Aleph, Halakha Tet Zayin, Rabban Gamliel Omer. Actually, is that what we're up to? No, I'm sorry, my mistake. One Mishnah earlier. Last time we got up to Perek Zayin, Halakha Tet Vav. Shammai Omer Aseh Toratecha Keva. Okay, so last week we studied the words of Hillel and his partner, because this was during the time of the Zugot, where there was a Nasi, a president of the Supreme Court, and there was an Avetin, akin to the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court. So the Nasi was above the Avetin, and basically this was the last one of the Zugot. This was the last one where you had two people ruling the Supreme Court and acting as the political representative of the Jewish people, Shammai. So it was Hillel and Shammai. And this week we're going to study the words of Shammai. And he says something interesting. Aseh Toratecha Keva. He says, we all have an obligation to study Torah. And that obligation is not established by the words of Shammai. That's one of the mitzvot aseh. One of the terek mitzvot is to study Torah. But what he says is that when you study Torah, the attitude you have is as important as the study itself. I want to explain what he means. And I will use the following analogy. Imagine for a moment a person who realizes he's getting a little older and he says, you know what? I want to start taking exercise seriously. So in his mind, he formulates an exercise plan. How many days a week is going to work out? What type of exercises he's going to do? For example, he says, I'm going to go jogging. I'll build up. I'll start, half a mile, then build up to a mile, then build up to 5 miles. So he has this whole plan, what he's going to be doing to get into shape. Now, if he is serious, as many people are, he will not just formulate the plan in his mind, but he will actually implement the plan. So once a person is in that mode of thinking, that he's determined to execute this plan, to implement this plan, that's it, he's going to do it. Nothing will stand in his way. So for example, if he needs to wake up early in the morning, he'll wake up early in the morning. He won't sleep in anymore. He'll make sure to waste less time, but he will get it done. And why will he get it done? Because his attitude is one where I must do this. It's essential for me to do this. I need to lose the weight. I need to get my body back into shape. I need my heart to be healthier. He decides that's what he wants to do, and he will do it. No ifs, ands, or buts. What Shammai is teaching us here is that it's the same thing with Talmud Torah. And basically, what Shammai is talking against is turning Talmud Torah into a leisure activity. For example, watching Shtisel. I don't know if anybody here has Netflix and watches Shtisel. Somebody told me there's a show on Netflix called Shtisel about a Haredi family in Jerusalem. So watching Shtisel on Netflix is a leisure activity. By that I mean to say, no one feels a sense of absence or a sense of loss if he were to miss an episode of Shtisel. He can still go on the next day and feel good about himself. But if, for example, let's go back to that person who now wants to take working out seriously. If something were to happen and he couldn't work out as planned, he will feel a sense of, I didn't accomplish what I need to accomplish, right? So what Shammai is saying is, Aseh Toratecha Keva. The Torah that you study should be done in a serious fashion. You should be stubborn about the goals that you set forth for yourself. My father, Alav Shalom, said something very correct about this. He said that it's not how much you study, right? I mean, obviously how much you study is important, it is. But the fact of the matter is that we all work And we are, as we learned in last week's class, we're all obligated to work, right? So the amount of Torah you study is in a sense less important than the tenacity with which you hold on to that little Torah that you are going to study. Meaning, when you study, make sure to be fully plugged in and don't give it up. Don't treat it in a less than serious fashion. So I've seen people at work who, when they're working, they're totally consumed by their work. And by the way, that's the halakha. The halakha requires that when you work, you be totally consumed by your work, that you take it seriously, especially if you're getting paid and you're an employee. You must take it seriously. You must work hard and honestly, right? So you're totally consumed by it. And if somebody calls you up to chat, you're like, you're not going to stop and start chatting to people. Like, you don't have time for that. This is work time, and you're not going to chat with people. So that's the idea of Talmud Torah. I remember when I was a young uh, Torah scholar, and I went to a nice place in Israel to study. What I noticed was something interesting. I was studying actually in a kollel where people, basically these were married people who were studying Torah. All that's what they did. They didn't have vocations. They didn't work. They didn't have jobs. What they did was they studied Torah all day. And what was interesting to me, I was there young. I was like there before law school. So I was kind of just enjoying myself. It was not. But I noticed something. I knew that in a year I'm going to be returning to the U.S. to start law school. I knew that. Um, and the people around me, they kind of had the whole day and the whole week and their whole lives to study. And because of that, they weren't as plugged in as I was. I knew that in this year, I need to finish this and this and this and that. And I had a whole set of things that I needed to finish. And I was so plugged into it. And I did it. I reached my goals. And I remember people walking in, they had their banana, their morning banana, eating on it. And they have the newspaper, the Haredi newspaper, Yated Ne'eman, and talking to each other about who the newspaper decided should be excommunicated this time around. Um, and it was a kind of this very flimsy attitude. Now, later on, when I started to work as an attorney, I realized people take work really seriously. And I said, if those people in the kollel would have taken the Torah as seriously as people take work, it would have been, would it be praiseworthy, or would it be that they're just taking it as seriously as people take work? But the inverse of that is, but if you don't take it as seriously as people take work, meaning your study is kind of flimsy and lackadaisical, then you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. That's the lesson of Shammai. Aseh Toratecha Keva. That's lesson number one. On a personal note, when I got married, I told, well, I don't want to say jokingly because it wasn't a joke, but I relate it to you all jokingly. When I got married, I told my wife that, there's not a lot of demands I have, but one of the demands is that when I'm studying Torah, I'm not to be disturbed for anything unless the Mashiach is calling me up and he needs my help to build the Bet HaMikdash. I said, otherwise, I don't want to be interrupted. And it hasn't happened once where the Mashiach called me up saying he needs my help to build the Bet HaMikdash. So that actually worked. It was a good plan. All right, let's go on to the next, to lesson number 2 of Shammai. Lesson number 2. Emor me'at va'aseh harbe. Really important. Sometimes somebody needs help and we make a promise we're going to help them. Don't ever promise more than you can do. There's a bunch of reasons for that. But you have to be very careful what you say. If anything, emor me'at, when you express your desire to help this person, and you in a sense commit yourself to help this person, you say, I will help you, always minimize the words that you use, minimize the promises, promise less. And then when it comes down to actually helping the person, I'll say how to bet. Then you should do more than you said, right? Um, the best example of this is Abraham Avinu. Abraham Avinu was sitting outside his tent and he wanted to do the mitzvah of Achnasat Orchim. And you may remember in Parashat Vayera, right? You may remember that when Abraham Avinu sees the Malachim and he invites the Malachim, what does he say? He says, Ve'ekhafat lechem. I want to give you a slice of bread. I want to give you a slice of bread. Please, let me give you a slice of bread. That was the promise. The promise was he's going to give them food. What food will he give them? A slice of bread. Now, for a person traveling in the desert who's hungry, who may not have seen a good meal in days, that's a very lovely offer. What hungry person would not want a slice of bread? And yet, although he says ve'ekhafat lechem, when it comes to what he actually does, the pasuk says, "Vayikach him'ah v'halav u'ben habakar asher asa vayiten lifnehem." He gives them a feast which is worthy of the greatest king. He brings them cattle. He makes shahitam the cattle. He gives them the most delicious meat. He gives them, of course, he gives them bread. But what amount of bread? Shalosh se'im kemach solet, bread made with the finest semolina flour. So delicious bread, and he gives them a huge feast. So that's a great example of emor me'at. What you promise, be circumspect in what you promise. Don't promise the world. But when it comes to doing, then you do a lot. Then you give them more. Then you surprise them. So a poor person comes, of course I will help you, and I want to help you. This is what I think I can do. And then when he actually arrives, you give him more than what you thought or what you told him to expect. That's the proper way. Pleasantly surprise people. As opposed to Abraham Avinu, you may recall the story of Ephron HaHitti. Ephron HaHitti was the owner of the Me'arat HaMachpelah, and Abraham Avinu needed to bury his wife, Sarah. And when he approaches Ephron HaHitti, he does so in the most respectful way possible. And Ephron HaHitti tells Abraham Avinu, this is something, meaning the Me'arat HaMachpelah, that you want to bury Sarah in, it's nothing. It's, what is this piece of land? Take the land. It's yours. It's just 400 gold coins. Take it. What is this? Implying that he's going to give it to Abraham Avinu as a gift. That was the implication of the statement. But when push came to shove, Abraham Avinu not only had to pay the full price, 400 shekel kesef, he had to give 400 shekel kesef over lasocher. It had to be not the regular coins, right? And this was a huge amount of money. 400 shekel kesef is huge, but it had to be over lasocher, a high grade of coin that was minted in a fashion that it was known this is real. This substance, the silver, it has no mixture in it, right? It was fully certified. So that's the most expensive coins, were the fully certified coins. So here we see Ephron HaHitti. He exemplifies the exact opposite of this. When he speaks to Abraham, he implies that he will give him the field for free. He never had an intention of doing that. When push comes to shove, he actually sells it for more than the full price. And that's exactly what Shammai is warning against. Finally, the third and final statement of Shammai, we said, Aseh Toratecha keva, emor me'at, va'aseh harbe, and finally, v'haveh, mekabel et kol ha'adam, beseber panim yafot. When you greet people, it should always be with a pleasant demeanor, in a nice manner. What does this mean? So, let's say you are in a situation where you want to help someone. And we said previously, emor me'at va'aseh harbeh. Let's say you're in a situation where perhaps you cannot do that. You cannot aseh harbeh. Maybe you can't help the person. Maybe you can't meet the person's expectations. Maybe he needs $5,000 and you only have $500. So it says, it's not just what you do, it's how you do it. Do it with a happy face. Let the person know that you care about him and that he's always welcome to ask you for help. Means when you are going to be in a situation where you need to help somebody, it's not enough to just give him whatever you can give him and maybe you're satisfying his needs, but do it with a happy face. Do it in a pleasant demeanor, because if you don't do it in a pleasant demeanor, here's what happens. Usually, when people need help, um, let's say a person is poor and he needs help, he can't pay his bills, whatever the situation is, and he gets help from someone, he feels automatically a sense of inferiority, a sense of he owes him, right? And it's a demeaning feeling. So he says, it's not enough to help. Do it in a way where the person feels that you really care about him, that you really love him. Because if you do it that way, then you're really helping the person, right? Because he doesn't feel like he's a burden, like he owes you, like he's beneath you. You understand the idea of the haveh mekabel et kol ha'adam beseber panim yafot. What beautiful musar for Am Yisrael, and it's beautiful that we have these values guiding us as a people, guiding us as a nation. And this, by the way, is coming from Shammai. Just remember, the Chachamim considered Shammai to be a bit of a kapdan, a bit of a strict person, who, no nonsense person. And even our tough Chachamim, the ones who are no nonsense Chachamim, you see how they had this beautiful attitude towards helping people and how to do it. So that's a Mishnah. That's the first Mishnah we studied today. That's a Mishnah of Shammai. And with that, we end the generations of the Zugot. This is the fifth and final pair. And now we are going to be going to the next generation. The next generation is going to be Mishnah Tet Zayin. Mishnah Tet Zayin is Rabban Gamliel. This Rabban Gamliel was not the son of Hillel. He was the grandson of Hillel. So Hillel had a son. The son of Hillel was called Shimon, or Rabbi Shimon. His son was Rabban Gamliel Hazaken. The son of Rabban Gamliel Hazaken was Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. The son of Rabban Shimon Gamliel was Rabban Gamliel de Yavne. His son was Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel from Usha, from the city Usha. And then his son is Rabbeinu HaKadosh. So you get some of the, you get the various generations. So Hillel, it started with Hillel Hazaken all the way down to Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rabbeinu HaKadosh was one of the greatest Hachamim ever. He's the one who edited, together with his Betin, they edited the Mishnayot. They took the Torah Shebe'al Peh and they transformed it into the Mishnayot. So here we're dealing with the grandson of Hillel, Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, and he was, of course, in the days of the Bayit Sheni. And he says as follows. Aseh lecha Rav. I'm going to explain it in a moment, but for now, you should have a single Rav. Rav means a Chacham, a teacher, right? Veistalek min hasafek. And in doing this, you will be removing yourself from situations of doubt. Istalek min hasafek. And finally, he says, Ve'al tarbe le'aser omadot. When you take the tithes from your fruit, from your grain, the ma'asrot, the ma'aser, don't do it based upon estimation. Actually measure the grain, and when you take the 10%, do it precisely. Okay, that's it. That's a statement of Rabban Gamliel HaZaken. I now want to explain the statement. First, why does he say, Aseh lecha Rav? You should have one teacher. We know that actually, on the contrary, we say, Ezu hacham halomed mikol adam. A wise person is a person who learned from many people, right? And here we're saying, Aseh lecha Rav. You should have a single Rav. So what is that about? There are a few explanations to this, but here's what I think is perhaps one of the better explanations. There comes our personal study. And when we study, we attain knowledge and we learn. And as we study more, we attain more knowledge. But just because we attain knowledge, sometimes a little knowledge can create a big danger. Because the big danger is when you have a little knowledge, you may deceive yourself into believing that you now understand the law well enough in order to make Pesach Halacha for yourself. That's where it's dangerous, right? That's where it gets very tricky. Because oftentimes, to be able to make Pesach Halacha, it's not enough to have studied one subject, but you have to have a mastery of all of the legal corpus of Am Yisrael. And without this mastery, if you decide to try to do Pesach Halacha, you could be making terrible mistakes, right? So even if you study as you should study, right, you may not be qualified to make Pesach Halacha. So it says, for situations of making actual Pesach Halacha, Aseh lecha Rav. You should have a Hacham that you go to, that gives you the halacha, and that you can rely on for the halacha. Oftentimes, well-intentioned people are clueless as to make a Pesach. I can tell you like a little about Yom HaAsmaut, for example. It's a good example. As I spoke about in my knis yesterday, and as I've spoken about on many occasions, I absolutely love Eretz Yisrael. I think it was a zechut that I was able to live in Eretz Yisrael for so many years as I did. And I think it's a zechut that my children were raised in Eretz Yisrael as they were. And it was simply a beautiful country, and I love it to no end. Like many people, I have my reservations about how well it's run. I think there's great things, that, for example, now it's Bibi Netanyahu for many years. I think he's done many great things for Israel. So even though I may feel that there are some things that can be changed and bettered and improved, of course, but the criticism is not the criticism of dogma, right? There are many dogmatic people who they have just hate and contempt and bitterness, and they can't say a good word. So on the one hand, I love Israel. On the other hand, I do have my slight reservations about the leadership, and that's okay. What country today, by the way, is run by intelligent leaders? I mean, today the world is run by leaders who one would wonder whether they have a functional prefrontal cortex. I mean, in general, this is a general statement about the leadership, and I see what's happening in our part of the world, and it's really remarkable. So that's fine. So I love Israel, and I also sometimes criticize perhaps or have some reservations about sometimes what the leadership does. But of course, I'm very thankful to God for the great miracle of Yom HaAtzmaut. I mean, I think it was an incredible series of miracles. It's not even a single miracle, and it's just miracles upon miracles that have been taking place over the course of decades. Incredible. We're living it. We live in those miracles. It's remarkable. So actually, I say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut because I'm thankful to God, and I feel it's appropriate to say thank you to God. By way of contrast, and just by way of example, can you imagine a child whose parents are perhaps not millionaires, and they take care of the child, they feed him, they give him clothing, they love the child, they send him to yeshiva so that he studies Torah, and then at the end, the child realizes that his parents are not rich, but he has a friend whose parents are rich, they're millionaires. What would you think of a child like that, whose parents are not millionaires, but they took care of him and they gave him, they didn't give him wasn't perfect, right? The child can have some reservations, as most children have reservations, right? About what their parents, how their parents raised them. Okay, I've heard that a lot. All right. But at some point, you must be thankful to your parents. Is that not the case? Now, what would we think of a child like this who is bitter against his parents because they weren't millionaires and they didn't give him that millionaire luxury lifestyle? What would you think of a child like that? Well, I think most of you would agree that he's incredibly immature and a very low personality. I mean, you would say this person really has to get his act together. I mean, what type of person doesn't appreciate what he has? And I say the same thing about Medinat Israel, to the extent that we may have reservations about where we are at this point in our history. It doesn't change in the least bit our obligation to thank God for the good that He's given us, right? And He's given us a lot of good. I mean, it's really beautiful over there. I got to tell you, it's stunning, and it's just wonderful to be there. So it's something we can all experience as our great grandparents may not have even have dreamed of what we experience or what we can experience when we go to Eretz Israel. So that's important. I wanted to say that because when I was in Israel, this is kind of related to that. So a lot of people would say Hallel. I say Hallel without beracha because when you say Hallel, you have the beracha asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. God has commanded us to perform the following mitzvah. So we were never commanded to say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut because we just don't have a bet din that can give us that can be mitaken, a takana to say Hallel in Yom HaAtzmaut. Inshallah, we should have a bet din soon, and I believe that when Am Yisrael establishes the Sanhedrin, one of the things the Sanhedrin will do indeed will be to say Hallel with beracha. They can do that, but you need a Sanhedrin, but we can't do that. So you see halacha is very subtle. So anyway, so I used to be in places in Israel, they'd say Hallel with beracha. I didn't say anything. We always have to treat people with respect, even if we may disagree with them. So they used to say Hallel with beracha. Then they would say, together with the Hallel, they would say a beracha, like we say when we light the Ner Chanukah. Asher asa nisim, Baruch ata Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, she'asa nisim la'avoteinu b'yamim ha'em, b'zeman hazeh. They would actually say that beracha b'shem u'malchut. Again, as a matter of halacha, it's a subtle point, but you can't on your own institute berachot. You need to have the proper legal forum to institute those berachot, right? So it's not for lack of Israel, for lack of love towards Israel. I love Israel to no end, but we have the law and we have to be careful. And these are subtle points. So today I saw something new. So what did I see today? I'm on a WhatsApp group in Israel, a synagogue of Harav Shlush, Alav Shalom. I don't know if the chief rabbi of Netanya passed away a few years ago, Harav David Shlush. So his son now carries on his father's teachings in his synagogue in Netanya, and I'm on that WhatsApp group. Somebody in the synagogue sent a video of a person doing Kiddush today for Yom HaAtzmaut, and I kid you not, it was literally Baruch Ata Hashem. He said the name of God. I'm not saying the name of God because I didn't lose my mind quite yet. Elokeinu melech haolam, and then it says Asher kideshanu b'mitzvotav v'rasa banu. Did you hear those words? Asher kideshanu b'mitzvotav v'rasa banu. We said the Kiddush of Friday night. But then he changed the wording to match Yom Ha'atzmaut, and finally said, Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yom HaCherut, something like that. People really have to understand that a little knowledge is very dangerous. That person, not only did he not do a mitzvah, but he violated one of the cardinal commandments. Lo t'sai Shem Adonai Elohecha l'shav. It's forbidden to just mention the name of God. You can't make up berachot, right? You can't just start saying, berachot, right and left berachot, because your feeling tells you to do so. That's not the way the halacha works. So, aseh lecha rab. You study Torah, you know something wonderful. You did a great mitzvah. But be careful. Find somebody who can be a posek halacha for you, because it's so easy to make a mistake. So you need somebody to help you. That's the thing. And therefore, by having that person to help you, behistalek min hasafek, you will be removing yourself from situations of doubt where you could be making mistakes and not even knowing it. Like that person, he had his whole family around the table. It was very festive. It was very beautiful. I'm very happy for him. I don't misunderstand me. I wish him only good. Chazit, he made a mistake. But he wouldn't have made the mistake if he would have consulted with a competent authority in halacha. That's the point. Aseh lecha rab. Behistalek min hasafek. By consulting with a competent authority in halacha, you will be removing yourself from situations of doubt. Okay. I'm sorry, I need to get myself a cup of water. I'm still a little hoarse. Better than last week, but still a little hoarse. So my apologies. Please give me a moment. Okay, I am back. And by the way, it goes both ways. Many times people like to or forbid things that don't need to be forbidden. A best example is Pesach. We talked a lot about Pesach a month or so ago, whatever. So I told you, like when I was in Israel, they had chairs kosher for Pesach. It just shows an incredible ignorance. But why, so why should a person spend more money for that, right? It's in a sense bal tashchit. Why are you wasting your money? Spending extra money, or they have a aluminum foil kasher for Pesach, and they actually give you an explanation. No, there's a substance they put on the foil, and that substance is really. It's utter nonsense. I'm not even gonna. Hold on. Let me admit somebody to the class. It's utter nonsense. It has nothing to do with Jewish law. So it's really important to have somebody that you consult, not just for chumrot, but also for kulot. It goes both ways, right? We don't want you doing things that you don't need to do, that are nonsensical. We don't want you making mistakes and going off the deep end on the other side and making terrible mistakes. You need to follow the requirements of the halacha. So it says, histalek min hasafek. And finally, ve'al tarbeh le'aser omadot. I will explain this. As you know, when a person has a farm, let's say he has grain, wheat, for example, he collects the wheat from the farm, he's obligated to give terumah. When you give terumah to the Kohen, there's no fixed measure from the Torah of the amount of terumah you give to the Kohen. We give about 50%, 50%, 1/50th, I'm sorry, Mechila, I hope I didn't scare anybody. Right? There's Ain Tovah, there's Ain Benonit, there's Ain Ra'ah. Okay. So you give a small amount of the terumah to the Kohen, but there's no fixed amount from the Torah. So if you give a little more or a little less than you intended, it's not the end of the world, because as I said, there is no fixed amount from the Torah. On the other hand, when you give the Ma'aser Rishon to the Levi, the Ma'aser Rishon has to actually be 10%. As I said, terumah is about 2%, more or less, terumah, 2%. The Ma'aser Rishon has to be 10%. Now, if you're going to do this in kind of like an approximate way, like, okay, I think I got this right, looks good. Well, okay. So the problem is that if you didn't take the right amount of Ma'aser, then you're defrauding the Levi, right? And the Levi now is getting cheated. And you're going to be eating something that doesn't really belong to you. Vice versa, if you give him too much, you're going to be giving him some tevel, the Hachamim say, because later on you have to take out Maaser Sheni from the remainder. Or Maaser Shelishi, depending on what year it is. So you can't do this approximate, you have to do it right. Oh, so he says, measure it carefully. Let's go back to the beginning of his statement. In halacha, in life, find a posek who you can rely on, because the same way, if you take 10% from your grains, but you do it kind of approximately in a sloppy manner, you're going to make a mistake. You can't do it approximately. If you gave too much, the Levi is eating tevel. If you gave too little, you're eating the Levi's food. You got to do it right. That's why aseh lecha rab. That's why you need to find a hacham who knows the halacha and has the ability to make the pesak halacha in the correct way. Because otherwise, it's going to be too much. When you have too much, it's no good. When you have too little, it's no good. It's messed up. Halacha is precise. If you are a doctor, when you give your patient the dosage that he needs to take, you give him the right dosage based upon his weight, based upon the nature of his sickness, whatever that is, but you give him the right dosage. And if the patient was on his own to decide to take half the dosage or double the dosage, the doctor will get angry at him, and rightfully so, because there's a precise science to this. That's the halacha. The halacha is a precise science, and the ones who administer the halacha are themselves hachamim, they're doctors, and they know how to properly administer the halacha in a way that will be beneficial for the person. That's the great lesson of Rabban Gamliel HaZaken, and what a great lesson it is. Let us now go to the son of Rabban Gamliel. The son of Rabban Gamliel is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin during the time that it was destroyed by the Romans. He himself was killed. It's not clear whether he was killed by the Romans, as some say that he was killed by the Romans. Others say that he was killed by the crazy fanatic Jews. In his days, there were crazy fanatic Jews who wanted to have Rome with war at all costs. It was very important to them to have a war with Rome. They, whatever. I mean, right. The greatest form of madness is religion as madness, right? So, it's just true. Nietzsche has a sentence about that. So this was just complete, it was just complete madness. What was taking place during the days of Beit Sheni is there were crazy fanatic, religious fanatic Jews who insisted upon engaging Rome in bitter warfare. And then there was the Hachamim, and most of the Hachamim realized that it's complete madness. And Rabban Shimon Gamliel himself was among the people who were more pro, trying to work out a compromise with the Romans, because otherwise we'll just all get killed anyway. So they killed him. That's what it looks like. It looks like he was killed by the fanatic Jews. Either way, during his days, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. The Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, and it was over. It was basically over. And it's ironic because Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel himself, because of the circumstances of his life, you don't have too many statements of his in the Gemara. You don't see too many statements of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. At least this Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. There's another one, his grandson, where you have a lot of statements of his actually. But this Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Hazit, he must have had a tough life. But this is one of the statements he said. So here it is. I'm going to read it for you now. Shimon beno Omer, Kol yamai gadalti ben hachachamim. Um, all of my life, I was privileged to be raised among wise men, right? Because he was, of course, the son of Rabban Gamliel HaZaken. His father was head of the Sanhedrin. So naturally, this young child, when he was growing up in Jerusalem, he was raised among the Hachamim. Kol yamai gadalti ben hachachamim. Velo masati laguf tov ella shetika. The best thing for one's physical health, laguf, for the physical health of a person, the best thing is to remain silent. Okay, there's a couple of layers that I want to unpeel in this statement. But first I want to finish, he has another two statements, and then I will go back and explain what we just read. Velo hamidrash hu ha'ikar ella ha'ma'aseh. The most important thing is not what you say, it's what you actually do. That's statement number two. Statement number three. If you are a person who talks excessively, you will end up making mistakes. You will end up bringing sin upon yourself. Those are the three statements of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Let us start with the first statement, that the best thing is to remain silent. I think about the pasuk in Mishleh. There's a great pasuk in Mishleh. It's in written by Shlomo HaMelech, as you know, and he says, "Gam evil maharish, hacham yachashev." You know, if you go into a knis and you don't say a word, right? You just sit quietly. So long as you don't say a word and you sit quietly, they may still think that you're a wise man. It's only when you open your mouth that they make the mistake and realize perhaps not. I was I was in Israel. I used to go to the Netz Minyan for Shahrit. I used to read the Torah there. My sons used to read the Torah with me, and then I'd give the derasha, whatever. So I was reading the Torah, and it was one of those pirashiyot where they have a lot of mehez with mapik, right? So, for example, asher lo ye'adaha vehefdaha le'am nochri lo yimshol. So there's you notice the head with the mapik, right? So somebody later on came to me, he says, Kvod Harav, Harav ta'aba kri'ah hayom. I said, oh, what happened? And I actually heard him while I was reading. I heard somebody correcting me. He says, why do you do like ya'ada? Like, what do you do? Why do you add like the extra hair there? I said, lo ya'adaha ve'eftas. I said, what? So what are you trying to say? He says, that's not the way to read it. I said, how do you read it? Yeah, I was just curious, more than anything. He says, no, he says, asher lo ya'ada. You don't say asher lo ya'ada. I say, really? That's what you learned? He says, no, I didn't learn it. I just, that's how you read it, isn't it? It was a bit embarrassing. I hope it was embarrassing for the person. It could be that he didn't have the sophistication to be embarrassed at his lack of knowledge. But nevertheless, I felt a little embarrassed for him, because here's a person who doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. And he, insisted upon coming over to me after the tefillah to show me his great wisdom and how how much he knows. And I was thinking of this pasuk. I could have thought that he's a great Talmid Chacham, as long on one condition, that he didn't open his mouth. Gam evil maharish hacham yachashev. That's the advice of Shlomo HaMelech. One day maybe we'll study the book of Mishleh, because it has a lot of great pearls of wisdom in it. So Abot Gamliel says, I was among wise people, and I know the value of not talking, because when you talk in the presence of wise people, you're bound to say something that is a bit foolish, right? So it's important to have a sense of humility. That's one layer. But he says it's good for the goof, it's good for your body. Lo masati laguf tov ela shetikasu. Why laguf? Why is it good for the body to remain silent? So there's something else here. And I'll tell you what the something else is. the body produces a lot of chemicals. Some of these chemicals are, like if you go running, and you have a good workout, so your body's going to produce some good chemicals. You feel great. I think it's endorphins. I'm not a great expert in the way this works, but I know that when I go running and I come back, I feel I have a lot of energy. So my body must be producing some sort of positive chemicals within it that make me feel good and energized, and I can study Torah better, and that feels great. Okay, the same way that the body can produce these positive chemicals within it, it can also produce these very negative chemicals. So let's say somebody insults me. Okay. If I was to insult him back and then start engaging him in this tense conversation, engendering within me angry feelings, I would actually be hurting myself physically. Because when a person gets angry and he engages in angry speech, that angry speech generates harmful chemicals. There's a pasuk in Mishle, Haser kas milibecha, vera'am mibesarecha. The best way to remove bad stuff from your flesh is to remove anger from your heart. If you remove anger from your heart, you're going to be removing bad stuff from your physical self. That's what he's talking about here. When he's talking about silence, he means silence in the face of calumnies. When a person is faced with calumnies, when a person is insulted, the natural reaction is to answer. And one of the things my father, in his great wisdom, taught me when he was young, when I was young, and he was also young, actually. He always used to teach me Torah whenever we would be walking. And unfortunately, there was, sometimes there was bad things said about my father, and he never took it seriously. And I once asked him, Dad, why don't you ever answer? Why do you? So he told me something very nice. Well, there's a couple of things he told me, but in this one instance, as we were walking actually on the way to Magen David Synagogue in Bay Parkway. Mickey Carey, Alav Hashem used to be there, and others, Eddie Levy. So we used to pray in Magen David Synagogue. This is way back in the late 70s, early 80s. We used to go to Magen David Synagogue. Anyway, and on the way as we were walking, there was this dog behind the fence, and he started barking, ah. So my father told me, "Are you now going to bark back at the dog?" I said, "No." He says, "Right, because that's a dog, and you don't have a need to engage the dog. You don't care that the dog is barking at you. He may think you're a bad person. It doesn't disturb you, nor should it disturb you. It's just the nature of life. Sometimes we get barked at." And he said, if I was to answer back to the dog, wouldn't that kind of bring me down to the level of the dog? So I got the message. I understood that. So, but even more than that, the minute you start barking back, you fill yourself with tension, with anger, and with bad stuff that's hurtful. It's hurtful for the blood pressure, for the heart, for the body. And that's why he says, if you have the power not to answer, just relax. Don't let it get to you. Lo masati laguf tov ela shetika. The best thing for your health is to not answer people. You don't need to answer them. Nothing will happen if you walk away. There's a beautiful Gemara in Masechet Gittin, Daf Lamed Vav. Let me see if I can find it for you. Give me a moment. Give me a moment, please. Lo masati laguf tov ela shetika. Okay. Right. The Gemara says as follows. This is again Masechet Gittin Daf Lamed Vav. It says, "Mi sheshomea cherpato veshotek velo meshiv." If a person hears somebody insulting him and he's silent, he doesn't answer. Alav hakatuv omer. Regarding this type of person, the pasuk, this is pasuk from the book of Shofetim, it says as follows, Ve'ohavav keset hashemesh bigvurato. Those who love God, they are like the rising sun, becoming stronger and more radiant every second. And the grandson of Harambam, Rabbi David Nalagid, gives a very beautiful explanation to this Gemara. He says that if a person is able to remain silent when hearing insults against him, he is like the rising sun. Why? Because don't we say in Birkat Kohanim the following pasuk? We say, Ya'er Adonai pana velecha v'chuneka. Hashem should shine his radiance upon you, right? Ya'er, there should be a shining upon you. What is that shining? That is the Shekhinah, of course. But Hashem doesn't put the Shekhinah upon people who are not worthy. But if you are a person who doesn't take those types of things seriously, who rises above the rest of humanity in so much as, okay, so you said what you said, and I'll continue with my life, that's when Hashem will shine the light upon you. And because of that, you will be like the rising sun, always attaining more wisdom, always attaining higher levels of Kedusha, of holiness. So that's a beautiful idea that we learn from Hazit Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, right? And finally, he says something important, equally important. This is his third statement. He says, Bechol hamarbe devarim mevi het. I'm sorry, Velo midrash ha'ikar, I skipped. I made a mistake. The first statement was, Lo masati laguf tov ela shetika, that we studied. The second statement now is Velo midrash ha'ikar ela amase. This is the second statement. It is not sufficient to attain knowledge and to speak of wisdom. Among the Greek philosophers, they attained knowledge and they spoke of wisdom, and they were quite smart, without doubt. And yet, they didn't believe that it's necessary to conduct your life based upon this wisdom, meaning wisdom was an abstract idea, and you attain that wisdom, and that's separate from your physical being and from your actual actions. But Abot Shimon Gamliel, and of course the Torah, completely disagrees with that. Velo midrash ha'ikar. It's not enough to have, to speak about ethics and morality. It's not enough to speak about it. You have to act in that way. Ela ma'aseh, the ikar is how you act, right? It's easy to talk the talk. It's more difficult to walk the walk, right? I think there's a saying like that in English, if I'm not mistaken. Unlike the Greek philosophers, by us, the Hakamim emphasized how important it is to hold ourselves to certain standards of behaviors. Harambam, he has an entire section in the Halakha, in Hilchot De'ot, where he says, what is the proper public conduct of a Hakam? And how, for example, when a Hakam goes to a store, the Hakam should try to act in the most proper way, fashion possible. He gives an example, and I see we only have a minute left. Let's say in this store, it's common for people to buy stuff on credit. You put your name in a notebook and whatever, and you pay later. And he says, if you're a Hakam, it would be much better to pay immediately. Don't expect other people to do you these to give you credit. Meaning, if you can't, you can't. We're not dealing with the same return. But if you have the ability to pay immediately, always try to pay immediately, right? Because you have to hold yourself to a standard that's a bit higher than the level of other people, right? So the idea of intellect being abstract and separate from one's actual behavior and conduct is foreign to Judaism. It's the exact opposite. As one's intellect grows and attains new levels of understanding, so also one's behavior should grow and attain new levels of conduct, right? You can't separate those two things. So Belina, next week, we will continue studying this. If anybody has questions, even though we don't have time, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that somebody may have at this point. And if not, I will wish you all a lovely evening and Shabbat Shalom, and looking forward to seeing you all next week.